Meanwhile, I would like to remember that we are organizing the 3rd World Congress on Logic and Religion in September in Sinaia from the 3rd of September to the 8th of September. Sinaia is a very nice location in Romagna. So everybody is welcome. We have a website. Assis will put the link of the website on the chat. And you can submit a talk until the 1st of May. Yeah, so the link is on the chat. So today we have a presentation. So as you know, our webinar is about logic and religion, connection between the two. And we are very glad today to have a talk by Itala Dottaviano. Evandro, with the chair of the session today, will speak more about her, but she's a very important figure of logic in Brazil. And her topic is exactly on the connection between logic and religion. She will speak about the problem of evil and Paraconsistent logic. So please, Evandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for everyone for coming. I will present a resume of Itala's curricula vitae. Itala Maria Lofredo Dottaviano is full professor of logic and the foundations of science at the University of Campinas, Unicamp, in Brazil. She is a founding member of the Center for Logic, Epistemology, and the History of Science, known as CLE, and of Brazilian Logic Society. She was director of CLE between 1986, 1993, and 2004 and 2009. President of SBL, that is the Brazilian Logic Society, between 1994 and 2003, and between 2011 and 2014. She is also president of the Committee on Logic in Latin America of the Association for Symbolic Logic, ASL, between 1993 and 1999, and provost of graduate studies at Unicamp 1913-1914. She is a member of editorial boards of several journals and the creator and the editor of the collection CLE, a collection of books in the fields of logic, epistemology, and the history of science, with over 80 published volumes. With several books published, her work focuses on logic and the foundation of mathematics, history and philosophy of science, algebra of logic, non-classical logic, universal logic, theory of self-organization and systemics. She has received several Brazilian and international awards, such as the Aristotle Medal by the Academy of Sciences and the Humanities of the Stagira Institute of the Higher Studies of Mexico. She is a member of the International Academy of Laws of Science, APS, in Brussels, being currently of its council. Thank you very much, Itla, for sharing with us this talk, and the word is yours.
Okay, let me share the slides. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation and for the possibility to participate in this webinar, this Logic and Religion webinar. I will speak about the logic problem of evil from a paraconsistent perspective. This is a joint work with a group that we have at the Center for Logic, coordinated by my colleague Fabio Maia Bertato. And in fact, I present a project research, a proposal that we are developing nowadays. I begin by a short introduction on the presence of a paraconsistent approach in the history of Western thought, focusing on the principle of non-contradiction and on the ex falso sequitur quodlibet that are central and fundamental for the proposal that we are going to present at the end of my talk. Okay, let's begin recalling the basic logical principles of classical deductive inference traditionally attributed to Aristotle. The first one, claimed by Aristotle as the most important of all the laws of thought, the principle of non-contradiction, that asserts that it's not the case of A and not A for any proposition A. The second one, the principle of the excluded middle, very well known, A or not A, and the principle of identity of reflexivity of identity that says that for every X, X is equal to X. Every theory based on the so-called Aristotelian classical logic, every theory based on these three basic rules of thought, every theory based on that is such that we can prove as a theorem, as a result in the theory, these sentences. A implies that not A implies B, whatever B, and or from A and not A, we can prove we have A and not A implies B, whatever B. That's these formulas are known as the principle ex falso sequitur quodlibet. What does it mean? Every theory based on the three Aristotelian rules of thought, every theory based on such principles is such that from any contradiction, from one contradiction, we, based on the modus ponens rule, that is the basic deductive rule of the theories based on the three Aristotelian principles, in every theory from one contradiction, we can deduce, we may prove every formula of the theory. And so the theory would be without interest. Let's recall some basic concepts. A theory whose underlying language has a symbol for negation is inconsistent if there is a formula of its language such that the formula and its negation are both theorems of the theory. Otherwise, the theory is called consistent. A theory is trivial if all formulas of its language are theorems. Observation. As I have just claimed, if the underlying logic of a theory is classical logic, classical, Aristotelian classical logic, or for another standard logic such as intuitionistic logic, inconsistency entails triviality and conversely. Inconsistency, let's say, the presence of one contradiction entails triviality because we would have any formula of the theory proved. And if any formula of the theory is proved, for sure, we have contradictions proved in the theory. So inconsistency entails triviality and conversely. But a logic is paraconsistent if it can be used as the underlying logic to inconsistent but non-trivial theories, which are called paraconsistent theories. In paraconsistent logics, the scope of the principle of non-contradiction is, in a certain sense, restricted. In every paraconsistent logic, from a formula and its negation, it's not possible in general to deduce any formula of the language. In paraconsistent logics, the notions of inconsistency and triviality are in fact independent notions, differently from the case of theories based on classical logic. In paraconsistent logics, the principle ex falso sequitur quod libet is not valid in general. In fact, I would like to observe that nowadays we use to define paraconsistent logics as the logics in which the principle ex falso sequitur quod libet is not valid in general. Our use in the stock of the terms consistency and inconsistency is syntactical, according to the original mathematical terminology of Hilbert and his school. But in the so-called logics of formal inconsistency, I will speak a little about them at the end of my talk. The logics of formal inconsistency, a special class of paraconsistent logics, the concept of consistency is considered as a primitive concept, and the concept of inconsistency is defined as the negation of consistency. And all concepts of inconsistent theory correspond in the logics of formal inconsistency to the concept of contradictory theories. And the consistent theories are called non-contradictory theories in the logics of formal inconsistency. Let's say during the last 15 years, with Evandro Gomes, who is chairing the session, we have developed a research, we continue it, on the presence, concerning the analysis of the presence of paraconsistent approaches in the history of Western thought. Our work attempts to discover how a truly paraconsistent perspective is constituted, as well as how logical principles, rules, and systems have expressed the various concepts of paraconsistency. We have focused our work on the history of the principle of non-contradiction and the ex falso sequitur quod libet rule. Such two issues are strictly connected and a basis to a logical history of paraconsistent positions all along the Western thought tradition. We have in 2017 published a book in Portuguese by the Unicamp University Press and by the Center for Logic of Unicamp. The book in Portuguese, the title in English is Beyond the Columns of Hercules, A History of Paraconsistency, from Heraclitus to Newton da Costa. And we are finishing to prepare an English extension of the book. And the new book will be published by the series of Springer by Santesi Library under the title Illuminating Contradiction, A History of Paraconsistency from Heraclitus of Ephesus to Newton da Costa. I'm mentioning the book because several of the results, several authors that I mentioned during this seminar are studied in the book. And some other very important will appear only in the English version of the book. And here, the center of the work, the basis is an analysis of the principle of non-contradiction and of the ex falso. Let's say the ex falso has some variance in the history of logic. It has been called ex falso sequitur quod libet, ex impossibili sequitur quod libet, ex contradictione sequitur quod libet, but nowadays authors used to call it principle of explosion. Motivated by a historical analysis, in special by the discussion on the ex falso held by several thinkers during the Middle Ages, though we recognize the distinct logical nuances, we consider the expression ex falso sequitur quod libet to embrace such principles as special types of the ex falso. As far as we know, the first thinker to use the expression idem esse ex contradictione was John of Salisbury in the 20th century, alluding to Adam of Balham's school position in the debate. Here is the reference, the Metalogicon by Johannes de Salisbury. I will give a general idea about paraconsistency in ancient Greek logic, some paraconsistent positions in medieval logic, because they are very important to our approach at the end of the seminar. And I will only mention contemporary paraconsistency and the creation of paraconsistent logic. Heraclitus' writings are known to us only through fragments, which explain his theory of the harmony of opposites and are particularly important for the discussion of the annulment of the principle of non-contradiction, attributed by Aristotle to Heraclitus, and for their influence on later discussion in ancient logic. Heraclitus' theory of the harmony of opposites provoked a debate on the study of contradiction in rational knowledge and in logic. In relation to the history of paraconsistent logic, we may conclude that the ideas of Heraclitus can be seen as a rational system of explanation which, if formalized, can describe contradictory states without, at the same time, trivializing itself. The contributions of Aristotle to the founder of logic and of scientific method have been amply celebrated. We argue that in the core of his theory of the syllogism, he describes some deductive schemes in which the presence of inconsistencies does not imply the trivialization of the logical theory involved. Though not explicit, the notion that Aristotle proposed results of paraconsistent character is corroborated by various theoretical situations he examined in the prior analytics, B15. He explains how valid syllogisms based on opposite, contrary, or contradictory premises can be obtained. Aristotle further deepens his analysis of the syllogistic consequence by stating in the prior analytics that a true conclusion may be derived from false premises in book 2. From opposite premises, contrary or contradictory, a valid but negative conclusion may be derived in specific moods of the second and the third figures in book B15. These results are the basis for some of the rules for the evaluation of valid syllogisms, justify some consequentiae in medieval logics, and are at the center of the debate on the ex falso sequitur quod libet. But as far as we know, Aristotle has never mentioned the ex falso. In chapter 11 of book 8 of the posterior analytics, Aristotle shows that the principle of non-contradiction is not a general presupposition for any demonstration whatever, but only for those in which the conclusion must be proved on its basis. We have a paper published in 2010, but there are some other papers previous to ours. And in this paper with Evandro Gomes, we have showed that it's possible to interpret the Aristotelian demonstration in the posterior analytics in contemporary terms, formalizing it in Da Costa's paraconsistent logic, predicate paraconsistent logic with equality C1 star. It seems possible to interpret the syllogisms on the basis of opposite premises as in a broad paraconsistent theory. We suggest in our work that the role of Aristotle in the prehistory of paraconsistent logic seems to be much more important than is customarily admitted. Underlying conditional propositions was a matter of great controversy among the Megarics and the Stoics. Thanks to this quarrel, we think that the ancient Megarics considered for conditionals something analogous to the logical principle of the ex falso. But the remaining fragments of the ancient Stoa, in special Chrysippus' study of conditionals, seem to endorse the conclusion that the Stoics were paraconsistentists in the broad sense. Let's go to logical paraconsistent elements in medieval authors. Based on some key authors of the medieval period, we present results related to contradiction and the ex falso sequitur quodlibet that are pertinent to the study of paraconsistent logic. One sees in the era of scholastic logic an intense debate on the validity of the ex falso at the center of the doctrine of topics, theories of implications, and duties disputes. The first writers, as far as we know, to mention the ex falso sequitur quodlibet or ex impossibile sequitur quodlibet were Gerland of Besançon and Peter Abelard. From the 13th century, there was intense debate concerning the validity of some consequentia that were later accepted, and one finds the quarrel over the legitimacy of the ex falso. But it is in the context of topical inferences and maximal propositions that the rejection of the ex falso by Peter Abelard, Père Abelard, is evident. In fact, it is in Père Abelard that we find a deep discussion on the ex falso, and he claims against the validity of the ex falso. His topical investigation leads Abelard to propose new semantic criteria for the notion of necessary consequence, consecutio necessitas, understood by some medieval authors in the manner of contemporary material implication. Abelard suggests that a stricter notion of consecutio is necessary. The antecedent of a true declarative conditional sentence requires the consequent intrinsically. This is a quotation by Abelard. It says, he wrote, inferences whose antecedents are impossible are logically possible, but they are false. For Abelard, explicitly, the ex falso is not valid, and from the false and from the impossible, any consequent, whatever, does not truly follow. So we interpret that relevant and paraconsistent elements seem to orient Abelard's logical options. Some other medieval authors of the 13th century objected to the ex falso. The veto on the ex falso can be placed within the panorama of a metaphysical, logical, epistemological approach of a paraconsistent character. We have studied some authors who are left opposite positions against the ex falso, as for instance, Robert of Melun, Henry of Ghent, and Petrus Hispanus. The position of Petrus Hispanus' position was very similar to Abelard's position. John of Salisbury, as I have just mentioned, attributes to Adam of Bauscham the thesis that from a contradiction follows the same, a thesis which implies the ex falso, which generalizes it. We have studied other thinkers in the medieval times. Nicholas of Hautefort, we have discovered this author very recently. It is very interesting and surprising, this position. We have studied William of Soissons, Walter Burley, John of Burda. Nicholas of Hautefort is explicitly against the ex falso. But Pseudoscotus in the 14th century, circa 1330, is one of the most intriguing personalities in the history of logic. Wise and talented, he developed in an extremely elegant way various logical theories typical of his period. Although Pseudoscotus was not the first to enunciate the ex falso, he was for some time during our era admitted as such. The argumentation of the author explains in part the merit achieved to this exposition. Aside from the ex falso, some of its corollaries are stated in his conclusions. We have also studied some authors, some strengthening scholastic perspectives on contradiction and the ex falso. We have studied Thomas Aquinas, Paul of Venice, Domingo de Soto, Pedro de Fonseca, Nicholas of Cusa. These authors will appear only in our English book. And we have dedicated a special section to Aquinas, a very beautiful section. Some of these themes where the study of them was suggested to me by Ian Volensky, who is here. We thank him the suggestions. In the development of medieval logic, the ex falso had been completely integrated into the well-developed theory of the consequentia, as we find in Pseudoscotus. The elegance of his treatment attests to the very natural development of the logical classical paradigm, in this case, in detriment to other perspectives, such as those of relevance and paraconsistency. But I tried to show that the discussion during the Middle Ages was very important, and that several known and recognized thinkers have claimed against the general validity of the ex falso. In the medieval author study, we see a strong theoretical tension with regards to the phenomenon of consistency and inconsistency in rational contexts, specifically philosophical or theological contexts. However, as we have seen, even several thinkers favorable to the ex falso, even Pseudoscotus himself, and for instance, Thomas of Aquinas, they consider and justify even being favorable to the ex falso. They justify the possibility of the restricted non-validity of the ex falso by means of conceptual and argumentative nuances. To the extent that logical classical citizenship may be considered to the rule, there is a logical classical solution to the conflict. Modern authors are more easily brought to accept as decisive the methodological criterion of logical classical coinage, according to which any inconsistencies or contradictions inevitably bring to the rational theory in which they occur to falsity, that means to triviality. This predominance in the modern period will only be definitively reconsidered with the advent of contemporary paraconsistency. As a consequence of our historiographic premises, we consider the Polish, Stanislaw Jaśkowski, and Newton da Costa, the creators of paraconsistent logic, motivated by problems arising from the presence of contradictions in specific rational contexts. They proposed and developed axiomatic logical systems capable of dealing with contradictions and inconsistencies without the trivialization of the implied theories. Stanislaw Jaskowski, in two papers introduced in 1948 and 1949, he introduced the non-logic deduct, his discursive logic, which tolerates contradictions. The motivation for this logic derives from the fact that the presence of contradictory statements in ordinary language is common, and the use of contradictory hypotheses is often necessary for the explanation of phenomena in scientific theories. Newton da Costa, in his first papers in the in the 60s, is very clear in proposing his hierarchies of paraconsistent logics as alternative axiomatic logical systems, developing as well logics of higher order that are able to overcome the limitations that contradictions impose on rational theories in the logical classical paradigm. Okay, we have nowadays several classes of paraconsistent logics. In general, and good paraconsistent logics, we can interpret these logics from under a certain point of view as subsystems of classical logic. But in fact, several paraconsistent logics we have studied are such that they can also be seen as extensions of classical logic. And so we would have inside of such paraconsistent things a well-behaved part that behaves classically. Let's go to the problem of evil and to the paraconsistent approach we would like to propose and to suggest. We have a special logic and religion group at the Center for Logical Epistemology and the History of Science, coordinated by Fabio Maia Bertato, my colleague and my former PhD student, Evandro Luiz Gomes and Gesiel Borges, who is also here, are participate in this group. We developed a project concerning formal approach to natural theology. This project is under the umbrella project supporting constructive research on the existence of God in Portuguese-speaking Latin America, and this big project is supported by the John Templeton Foundation. Recently, Fabio Bertato published by Manuscrito in International Journal of Philosophy a very intriguing paper, Sketch for a Formal Natural Theology, Existence and Uniqueness of God. I will speak about the system Fabio has introduced in this paper. But very recently, Bertato with Gesiel Borges da Silva, they have published two papers, a first-order model theodicy, God, evil, and religious determinants by South American Journal of Logic, and also published by the Educatia Philosophica. They have published a paper, Formal Theodicy, Religious Determinism, and the Logical Problem of Evil. Much of the things I'm going to speak are based on these papers. Bertato, in the paper published by Manuscrito, introduced a non-deterministic first-order theory, classical. It's classical, based on the three basic rules of thought by Aristotle. He introduced some fundamental concepts concerning divine beings, necessary beings, supreme beings are formally introduced. It is proved in the paper that the existence of evil is consistent with the properties of divinity. But he also proved theorems of existence and unicity of a divine being according to the perspective of classical theism. I'm giving some general ideas, only the ideas necessary for my discussion. Bertato considers a domain of discourse constituted whose elements are non-contradictory, are all the possible objects, all the possible situations. In the language, very well presented, a first order language, he denotes that P has an actual existence, a situation, has an actual existence, he denotes by alpha P. P is good by delta P. P is evil by CP. WXP denotes X wills P. KXP denotes K knows P. And DX denotes X is divine. Okay, and so he defines the concepts of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. X is omnipotent. Here is formally written. This equal equivalence is defined by, and this is the logical, the classical, strict implication. X is omnipotent if and only if, for any situation P, X willing P implies the actuality of P. This is the omnipotence. Let's recall classically. Let's recall the logical meaning. This doesn't mean that alpha P implies WXP. This doesn't mean that not W implies not alpha P. But this means from the classical point of view that not alpha P implies not WU. And the negation of omnipotence, if you put the negation and apply the negation to the sentence, the negation of the omnipotence means there is a situation P such that X wills P, and it's not the case of alpha P. That would be the negation. Okay, omniscience is defined. The omniscience is defined by X is omniscient if and only if, for any situation P, the actuality of P implies that X knows P. The negation would be there exists a situation P such that alpha P, and it is not the case that X knows P. The third property, the third characteristic, the omnibenevolence, is defined by X is omnibenevolent if and only if, for every situation P, X willing P implies the goodness of P. The negation of this property would be there is a situation such that X wills P, and it is not the case of the goodness of P. X is divine if and only if X possesses the three divine properties. If and only if X is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. The negation if X is not divine if he is not omnipotent, or he is not omniscient, or he is not omnibenevolent. Bertato introduces only two axioms, but we have all classical logic underlying the system. The two specific axioms are for every situation, the goodness of X implies the non-evil of X. The second axiom, there is a situation such that it is actual and it is bad, it's evil. Okay, using classical logic and the logical meaning, logical reasoning, we have the second axiom, that is a situation, actual and evil. According to classical Aristotelian logic, we have an instance M such that M is a situation and M is evil. But from here, we have the situation M and the evil of M. According to axiom 1, the evil of M means that M is not good. According to the definition D3, we have that it is not the case that X wills M, and according to axiom 2, to definition 2, we have that X knows M. And so we have an actual bad, evil situation, not desired, not willed by X, by God, but known by God. Okay, here we have a scheme, an evil situation and the actual situation. M is bad and the actual situation. We could have two possibilities because we are dealing with classical logic. God knows M or God doesn't know M. If God doesn't know M, God is not omniscient. God is not omniscient. If God knows M, that is the case according to our reasoning, we have two possible situations. God wills M or God doesn't will M. If God doesn't will M, God is not omnipotent. If God wills M, God is not omnibenevolent. We have another scheme here that I can return after, but a scheme where I put in a graphic the ideas I have discussed in the previous one. Let's go. Let's discuss possible, the paraconsistent approach we are proposing. Recall that in paraconsistent logics, the principle ex falsus ex quod lib is not valid in general. If we have, the principle says that from a contradiction, we have the triviality of the involved theory. When Newton da Costa introduced his systems, this happened to the Jaskowski discussive logic. Newton da Costa introduced a hierarchy of propositional calculi with specific axiomatics, but he introduced, aside the basic operators for negation, disjunction, conjunction, and implication, he defined a new operator. I'm denoting it by the ball. Alpha ball means, by definition, that it is not the case of alpha and not alpha. This means that in the class of formulas introduced by Newton da Costa in his calculi, we have a special formula that behave classically. Newton da Costa called this formula as well-behaved formulas. And in his systems, he has proved that when a formula is well-behaved, if you have A and the negation of A, then we have the explosion. And this would be the specific principle of explosion for da Costa's, for paraconsistent logics, and for a big class of paraconsistent logics. So we have a restricted principle of explosion, but it is only valid for the well-behaved formulas. In the good paraconsistent logics, we have what? Besides the general negation, paraconsistent negation, this negation, we can decide another connective for negation that we call strong negation, defined by the strong negation of a formula is the paraconsistent negation and the good behavior of the formula. And we have proved that in our general paraconsistent logics, that in the paraconsistent logics, we have this negation, the general paraconsistent negation, and this strong negation behaves as classical negation. And for this negation, all the formulas, if you substitute the general negation for this strong negation, all the classical results are valid. Okay, let's recall the paraconsistent, the omnipotence. We would like that in this principle, the converse of the implication would be valid, because we would like to identify the actual situation with the situations that X wills, God wills. But if we put this in the systems by using classical logic, we would have contradictions. And as theories based on classical logic, contradictions entail triviality, would have triviality. But our proposal is that if instead of using classical logic, if you use a paraconsistent logic, we could have contradictions without trivialization. And we could have the equivalence in the principle of omnipotence, I will show you, without trivializing the system. We would propose the principle, the paraconsistent omnipotence principle for every situation P. X willing P is equivalent, that is, if and only if the actuality of P. We would have, using axiom 1 and 2, by axiom 2, we would have alpha M and psi M, the actuality of M and the evil of M. Here, we obtain Cm. From here, we obtain alpha M. But according to the paraconsistent omnipotence definition, from alpha M, we would have X wills M. And we would have by T3 the definition of omnibenevolence, that delta M, the goodness of M. We would have the presence M as a bad situation, but M as a goodness. But for us, this would not be a problem. Our system would be non-deterministic. We would not have the trivialization of the system and would have theological fatalism. Let's see. If there is M such that alpha M and psi M, we would have delta M, the goodness of M, and the evil of M. And we could interpret that an evil under certain aspects could be a goodness on account of its consequences. From alpha and not alpha, we would not have trivialization. We would have to look for the specific results for this kind of specific contradiction. The paraconsistent omnipotence, from the semantic point of view, could be interpreted from various perspectives as an effective deliberate will. X wills, when X wills, it occurs. It's like fiat. But it could be a permissive will. We could use a more, the weak, the general negation. And we would interpret will, the will, as a permissive will, as like X wants to permit. X does not necessarily will. It can occur, but not necessarily. Okay, we have several paraconsistent systems in the literature. Some of the systems are modal, are many-valued logics, are fuzzy logics, and we have also some paraconsistent logics that are also intuitionistic. Recently, my colleagues from Clay, Carnielli, João Marcos, and Marcelo Conilho, they have introduced a special class of paraconsistent logics known as logics of formal inconsistency. Instead of using a syntactic Hilbertian concept of consistency, they proposed a connective, a ball connective, that corresponds in fact intuitively to the Da Costa's ball connective of well behavior. They have proposed a primitive operator of consistency. And so when I read ball alpha, it is denoting alpha is consistent. The formula alpha is consistent. And that is the defined primitive ball, black ball. Alpha means alpha is not consistent. Alpha is inconsistent. In these LFIs, we have also the principle of explosion, exactly equal to the principle of Da Costa's logics. But here it has another meaning because the ball operator is primitive. The concept of consistency is primitive, like more or less if it was it is intuitively not contradictory formula. And the principle of explosion is if alpha is consistent from the contradiction alpha not alpha, we entail any formula beta. We could propose, we have not chosen the paraconsistent system we want to use in order to develop our problem. But we could use two kinds of paraconsistent system by using the operator, the primitive operator of consistency, or by using the general paraconsistent negation for not. In the second case, using the axiom 1, as we understand the axiom because we cannot capture all the aspects of the negation. Contradictions may occur without the trivialization of the system. If you use the operator of consistency, every formula alpha, or idea is that every formula alpha that involves the binomial and derivatives would be considered as inconsistent, and every formula alpha that involves axiological values would be considered inconsistent. Delta and psi are considered inconsistent too. So, formulas involving divine will, divine properties, or axiological values would be inconsistent. And so, if we obtain contradictions involving this kind of formulas, they would not lead to triviality of the system. But all the other formulas, they will be considered well-behaved. Even if you introduce the system from the approach of the Paraconsistent Da Costa systems, or some systems we have worked, or if we consider them from the LFI, logical form and consistent approaches. I would like to recall, I have never discussed this with Evandro, some authors like Nicholas of Cusa, Thomas Aquinas, even Pseudo-Scotus, have discussed it in spite of considering the ex falso as fundamental, as a result, as basic, as accepted. They have discussed set some sentences, some properties concerning some special beings for which the ex falso would not be valid. And it seems that here we could, with this kind of approach, also to incorporate the positions of some thinkers from the Middle Ages that have accepted the ex falso. And so the proposal is this: to use a paraconsistent logic as the underlying logic for a system in which we can introduce the system for more or less like Bertato and Gesiel have worked. We have not decided. Fabio Bertato began thinking, he discussed it with me that he would like to use first the weakest logical formal inconsistent that is known as MBC. It's a very weak logic. Okay, we'll try to use it. But I'm thinking that it would be better to use a stronger logic. Like, for instance, the Da Costa's logic C1 or the logic J3 that was studied and introduced in my PhD thesis. That is a paraconsistent logic. It is modal. It has the operators for necessity and possibility. It is paraconsistent. In it, the principle of non-contradiction is valid in general, and it is free-valued. with an intermediate value 1/2. We have three values, 0, 1, and 1/2. But this intermediate value is a distinguished value. And so we may have sentence such that the sentence and its negation are both valid. And so here I'm proposing a project of research. We intend to look for a special and good paraconsistent system based on which we could discuss the problem of evil. Claiming that when we obtain specific contradictions that we want to obtain, we want the possibility to obtain this kind of contradictions when they involve divine beings, the contradictions will not lead to the triviality of the system. And so this is our research project, and thank you for the attention, and we would like to hear your critiques and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Itala. Thank you, Itala, for sharing with us these interesting results and ideas on the history of paraconsistent logic and paraconsistency, connecting the topic to the problem of evil and the Bertato's and the Clay team research results on LFIs. We start now the discussion time. We have now time for questions.
Jair, não estamos, we are not.
Gesiel.
Yeah, I am here. All right.
The word is yours.
Hi, Itala. Thanks for your talk. I appreciate your work, and thanks for sharing with us your thoughts on this. I would like to know what is, the logical problem of evil appears in a context where what is at stake is the rationality of theism. The idea that God, an omniscient, omnipotent God would be contradictory with evil is unpleasant or can lead to the rationality of theism. I would like to know in what ways do you think a paraconsistent logic can maybe enlighten or shed some light on the question of the rationality of theism? Thanks.
Yeah, Giselle, I don't know if I can answer it completely, but I think that by using paraconsistent logic, and we would like to use some different paraconsistent logics in order to choose a best one, we could deal with a divine will with distinct strength. We would have a will, a strong will, but we would have also a permissive will, for which we could have the contradiction. And we could think that the permission, God wills something, but in fact, he desires something, but it is not obligatory. And if it doesn't happen, or if the contradiction of the will happens, maybe the presence of contradiction could be informative and could deal to some other goodness without trivialization of the good. That's the idea. I don't know if I replied you correctly.
So would you say...
I think that we could open horizons for the discussion.
Yes, I see. So would you say that maybe the notion of trivialization is the one that impacts the most our question on whether theism is rational or not when it comes to taking into account?
Yes, it's the validity of that false. because everybody has studied it by using a classical logic or a kind of classical logic as the underlying logic. And when you become astonished at the presence of contradiction, it's a problem. Because as you have the classical logic as the underlying logic, by the presence of the ex falso, you would have the trivialization. You stop thinking. And so if you have a special paraconsistent logic, a good paraconsistent logic as the underlying logic, maybe the presence of a contradiction would be informative, would be good for the comprehension of the problem we are discussing. Because you could discuss which kind of consequence you could do. As for instance, Aristotle, in the book, he says that special kind, the contradictions from contradictions, we may derive a special kind of formulas. For instance, he says negative formulas or negative formulas. We could do with some kind of them. We could discover a kind of development of a logic for a good logical discussion of the problem.
Okay, thank you.
And the next speaker, the question, Ian Walensky, Professor Ian Walensky, please.
Okay, thanks for your talk. But I have the following problem. What is evil? Because we have two approaches according to this talk, possibly. One, what is evil according to God? And second, what is evil according to human beings? And it is very easily to prove that even under classical logic, evil as something what is conceived by God, if any, is simply consistent, because we with God's existence and properties. By the way, God, according to theology, is a simple being, so benevolence, omniscience, and omnipotence are practically the same, and this is the problem. But now the question of contradiction is related to human understanding of evil. And I think that paraconsistent logic doesn't change problems, but it is only ethical problem. Not logical. According to my intuition, the problem is not in the existence of evil, but with distribution of evil.
I agree with you, Jan. Nice to meet you. Even that virtually. I agree with you. The question concerns the human comprehension. But I'm proposing that the human comprehension could be expressed by a consistent logic in which there is a formal proposal, there is a formal language and formal definitions, formal axioms and rules that allow us to deal with the human comprehension such that the inconsistency derived in the system that is related to the human comprehension in the system, in the formal system, does not lead in the formal system to triviality. That's the question. We have a formal approach that allows us to differentiate human beings and divine beings by using a paraconsistent logic, by using two kinds of negation and by using a logic in which the ex falso is not valid in general, as several medieval authors have claimed, as Peter Abelard, Petrus Hispanus, even Aquinas and Pseudo-Scotus, and Nicholas of Cusa, for instance. That's my approach, my proposal. We would have to develop this with Gisiel, Ivan, and Fabio, probably. Thanks, Julio.
Anderson.
The Anderson, would you
Yeah.
like to say something? To say something?
If nobody, I have some historical remark. You know about triviality and Jaśkowski and Polish school. There's a line from Łukasiewicz via Tarski to Jaśkowski.
Yes.
The triviality is perhaps not so much a possibility to deriving from everything from contradiction, but rather, as Tarski very clearly said that the contradiction is something which devastates the difference between true and false. And formal exposition of this idea is that contradiction makes every sentence of a theorem of logic. So you cannot distinguish between true and false logical contradictory sentences. So perhaps this is, and according to Łukasiewicz and Tarski, contradiction, the principle of contradiction excluded have two meanings, logical and metalogical. It is very important to distinguish both.
Yes, several medieval authors have discussed the principle of homological and metalogical approach. And I agree with you, Jaśkowski, in his paper of 48, the first paper, he is completely clear. He claims that he would like to propose and to discover a system in which, in a discussion, in which the presence of two contradictory positions, we would not have the ever-completeness of the system. I remember that Perjanov claimed that the translation of the Polish word used by Jaśkowski to ever-completeness was not a good translation. That we would have assumed another word on the English version of the paper. But the idea was the ever-completeness, an idea that we nowadays interpret as triviality, exactly as you said, Jan. Every sentence of the language would be a theorem. I agree with you. The motivation by Jaśkowski was a little different from the motivation by Da Costa. Da Costa began claiming that the principle of contradiction would not be valid in general, and then he obtains that the ex falso is not valid.
That's okay. The next question, Irina Starikova, please. I don't know if I mentioned your name correctly.
Irina.
Irina.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hi, Itala. Thank you so much. Such an interesting talk, very interesting. And my question is concerning motivations for paraconsistent logic, and especially concerning your research, the historical research. As I understood, motivations to move from classical approach to non-classical paraconsistent approach can be, motivations can vary. And as I understood, Abelard, for example, he was trying to stay classical, but he moved to paraconsistent. And my question is whether motivations were always different, or do they converge to some pattern overall based on your research?
Irina, thanks for the question. Sorry, you didn't finish.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you finish? Okay, when we decided, when our research began, it was when Evandro Luis Gomes came to study and to begin his PhD with me. But the initial proposal was to prepare a work on the history of paraconsistent logic. But then we decided, because the history of paraconsistent logic, we have some papers, and in the literature, and even papers by papers by us, we identify forerunners of paraconsistent logic in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. But we decided to research, to investigate the presence of paraconsistent approaches in the history of the Western thought. And it was a surprise. Aristotle didn't propose a paraconsistent logic. The Stoics didn't propose. Peter Abelard discussed deeply the question concerning the contradictions and the ex falso. He claimed against the general validity of the ex falso, but the concerns during the medieval ages were much more philosophical, metaphysical, theological. They didn't propose a logic, a paraconsistent logic. This came to happen only during the 20th century. And Newton da Costa proposed it, he proposed it in the 50s in a paper, a principle he called the principle of tolerance. Every theory would be acceptable if it was not trivial. Jaskowski proposed a system in which the presence of contradiction would not due to triviality, to over-completeness of the system. And so the approaches at the 20th century seem to be distinct. But when we developed our investigation, we identified some discussions very fundamental, and several thinkers discussed the general validity of the ex falso and some other ones of the principle of non-contradiction. But they didn't propose a logic. It was a philosophical discussion. But during this 20th century, we had the proposal of paraconsistent logics. And now with this research, we can connect the discovering the creation of these paraconsistent logics with some previous discussions in the history, and with discussions concerning not only the principle of non-contradiction and ex falso, but the meaning of the conditional. The meaning, they have discussed the general validity of the Aristotelian, so-called Aristotelian material implication. The discussion by Abelard is concerned to the meaning of conditional. In Galland of Besançon too. And then they finished and not accepting the ex falso in general. And so the discussion involves conditional in the Stoics, for instance, the meaning of negation, the principle of non-contradiction, and finally, the ex falso. And for Da Costa, the discussion is founded in a discussion concerning the negation. Also for Jaskowski, it seems. But in Middle Ages, it was founded in discussion concerning negation, conditional. And so in our work, we tried to connect these discussions. And now the idea is, based on the discussion on the ex falso, maybe we could propose a system in order to discuss theological questions, the problem of evil, by using a paraconsistent logic, in which we may have distinct kinds, in the same system, distinct kinds of negation. And so we can, under a certain approach, not to accept the ex falso or the principle of non-contradiction in general. That is our proposal. Maybe we could do.
Thank you, Itala. Actually, my question was, what philosophical and theological problems motivated the ancient logicians to argue about classical approach?
They were discussing the consequential, the duties, and the motivation of theological.
Yeah, Itala, maybe I can help. I can comment something about it. For example, in Abelard's time, in 12th century, they had some problems emerging about the Trinitary theology. And ex falso rule is a kind of inference that have potential to derive inconvenient conclusions concerning Trinitary theology. For example, the approach of Abelard and the others in his time, Petrus Hispanus, most the logicians in Middle Ages or advocate for relevantist approach on consequence relation, and with this stronger notion of implication and logical consequence relation, they avoid inconvenient conclusions, for example, in special chapters of theology. The most sensitive ones related to the main dogmas of Christianity. This is the explanation, the hypothesis. For example, William of Ockham in the 14th century, he quotes explicitly in his Summa Totius Logicae that he uses as example a premise such that God doesn't exist. This is an example for Occam's that are an absurd, and from this absurdity you couldn't get anything. And William of Ockham is one of these authors also who had blocked the ex falso, that from a falsity or a contradiction or an absurdity, that everything could be entailed about from that.
Okay, I think we are reaching the end of our webinar today, and I would like to thank all the participants, especially, of course, Itala Dota, nice presentation, and Evandro for the chairing the session. I would like also to remember that we'll organize the next Congress on Logical Knowledge in Romania in September. And now Assis will say a few words about the next session of the webinar. Assis?
Thank you.
Hi, so next section of the webinar will take place, hold on. Let me take a look at it. So next section of the webinar will have Professor Arabayan Otte speaking about African perspectives on God and the problem of evil. So I'll be the chair myself. So we'll still be talking about the problem of evil. So I welcome everyone who is here to also participate in the next section of the webinar. Okay, so thank you very much. I really appreciate your participation. Have a nice day.
Thank you.